to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
In 1961, with those very words, JFK got the ball rolling on a space project to match the Soviets, who were very much ahead at this time. In 1969, the United States managed to pull this off. Many people are familiar with Neil Armstrong's first steps on the moon, but why have we invested so much effort and time into space projects? Space race began as an arms race between the respective militaries of the United States and the Soviet Union. World War II had demonstrated to the world that rocket technology would drive modern warfare, and as such, the US and Russia locked themselves in a race to have the most superior technology. As technology advanced and powerful intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, were developed by both countries, the arms race gave way to another race, the space race. What was the goal of the space race? Since obviously the US and Soviets were competing, what would count as winning? Well, for JFK, it was landing a man on the moon, before the Soviets. The Soviets had already brought humanity into the space age with the launch of the Sputnik satellite, which they set out on October 4th, 1957. A year later, in 1958, the United States launched its own satellite, Explorer 1, designed by the U.S. Army under direction of rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. In the same year, Dwight D. Eisenhower signed a public order creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or as we all know, NASA. In 1959, the Soviets had another victory with the launch of Luna 2, the first space probe to hit the moon. And 2 years later, in April of 1961, the Soviets sent Yuri Gagarin to be the first person to orbit Earth. Since the US were really falling behind, they started the effort to send a man into space, which they called Project Mercury. Engineers at NASA made a smaller capsule, far lighter than Vostok, or the spacecraft that Yuri traveled in. Then, NASA tested it with chimpanzees. Chimpanzees! That's crazy. In February of 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. So, with all of this going on, how did they get funded? How did they get funding for this? Well, from 1961 to 1964, NASA's budget increased almost 500%, and the lunar landing program eventually involved 34,000 NASA employees. Apollo suffered a setback in January in 1967 after 3 astronauts were killed when their spacecraft caught fire during a launch simulation. December 1968 saw the launch of Apollo 8, the first manned space mission to orbit the moon. Finally, 1969, on July 16th, U.S. astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz, no, not that Buzz, Aldrin, and Michael Collins set off on the Apollo 11 space mission, the first landing attempt. Then, on July 20th, Armstrong walked on the moon's surface. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. So, who won the space race in the end? Soviets or Americans? By landing on the moon, this illustrated that the Americans had won. From beginning to end, the Americans' public attention was captivated by the space race, and both sides were covered heavily by national media. But by putting a man on the moon, America was ultimately the winner.